Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to Berkeley Lab STEM Career Talks. This is our opportunity to showcase different careers in STEM with Berkeley Lab staff and scientists, along with colleagues from all over the world. My name is Elisa Vitale and I'm the Content Instruction Coordinator for the K-12 STEM Education Outreach Program, which is part of our Government Community Relations Office here at Berkeley Lab. As a reminder, we've turned on our live transcription. There's a button at the bottom of your screen that allows for closed captioning during the session. And we are also recording this talk to share with future students. So Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory is one of 17 Department of Energy national labs located in Berkeley, California. Berkeley Lab is known for its leadership in innovative research and team science and has been recognized with 14 Nobel Prizes and credited with the discovery of 16 elements on the periodic table. This year, Berkeley Lab is celebrating its 90th anniversary. So with Earth Day coming up on April 22nd, here are some upcoming events centered around the Earth's climate and environment. On April 20th, the Department of Energy will host an Instagram live session where climate scientists from DOE and NASA share their day-to-day work and how they prepared for their careers. On April 23rd, the Berkeley Lab K-12 team will be hosting a live science event on exploring Earth. This will feature scientists from the Joint Genome Institute who will share about the importance of microbes in the ocean for the Earth's environment. And we will also have some high school and college students who will share the experience in environmental activities. Finally, on April 30th, as part of Berkeley Lab's 90th anniversary speaker series, Berkeley Lab researchers will share how they are helping advance scalable and economical clean energy solutions to mitigate climate change. So we are very excited to continue our series of spring STEM career talks. Today, we will talk with our panelists about the field of renewable energy with insights from various lenses, including research and policy. Our panelists will first introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their career trajectory, and then we will get into a discussion about their experiences and work. So please feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat box, and we'll make sure to get to them later on. So I would like to introduce our first speaker and get things started. Sydney Prince-Forster is a scientific engineering associate in the electricity markets and policy department. So Sydney, you can go ahead and turn on your camera, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. So I've been at the lab for a couple of years, and just running through my general trajectory. I grew up here in the Bay Area. I went to high school. I don't know if I was ever particularly interested in STEM above anything else. I think most of my favorite subjects had to do with the teachers that I had. So, for example, I really love my chemistry teacher and one of my math teachers, but I didn't really much like my physics teacher. So and I liked English, so I didn't really have any specific focus. But I was just curious about a lot of different things. I went to college at Columbia University. When I started, I thought I was going to major in Hispanic studies and visual arts. I didn't necessarily think I had very much talent in STEM. I wasn't very good at test taking in high school. And actually, one fun fact was, even though I graduated with a theoretical math degree from Columbia, I was almost held back in third grade because of my math skills. So things can turn around. I really enjoyed getting to know a bunch of different topics. And essentially what had happened was I had a really great math teacher, and the whole major was super collaborative. And I ended up just taking more and more classes in it, and then decided to finish the major. And along the way, I had spoken to a dean actually that served as somewhat of a mentor, and she encouraged me to maybe try for this 3-2 combined program with engineering. And this is actually, Columbia does this with a bunch of other schools in the US, I think maybe hundreds, I'm not even sure, but I was local, so I just did it I was actually at Barnard College and then just moved across the street. And I was able to do some research there as kind of more of a chemical engineer. My research was essentially on the catalyst that you put at the end of cars. So that converts more harmful greenhouse gases into less harmful, but still greenhouse gases. And throughout my time, I had a few different internships. And again, I was always really interested in sustainability, but I was actually mostly focused on water resource. So some of these earlier internships in energy opened my eyes up to the whole field of energy. And I put every internship up here, including the ones that I don't even put on my resume anymore, because I think that it was just as important to do a bunch of internships that I ended up really not liking. They weren't very good fits, because I think that it was almost equally helpful to understand like what wasn't a good fit versus what was a really good fit for me personally. So yeah, so from there, I actually worked at a utility for a couple of years. And again, coming out of school, I was thinking about going into water resource issues. But what happened when I was in New York City was the state passed this like new legislature, and the whole world was kind of looking at New York. And I had this job opportunity that was essentially kind of like once in a lifetime opportunity to be in the front lines of this really like pivotal clean energy change for the state of New York and potentially the rest of the nation. So I actually kind of made a split-second decision to change my mind, fully go into energy, and that's kind of where my career really took off. So then after 2.5 years there, I went to grad school at Michigan. And the reason for that was just because work at the utility was super great. I learned a ton, but it is slow moving. I think kind of in any regulatory space, it can be a little bit slow moving. And so I wanted to do a bit more research in this space and also have a bit more diversity in my day-to-day work. So I wanted to get some research done there. So that's why I went to grad school. And I had a few more internships in research. I put them up here in case you guys want to ask about it later. And then I moved onto Berkeley. And I have in the upper right corner, another thing that, again, you can ask me about, I won't go into a ton, but I took this opportunity for like, with internships, with college, to just go to a bunch of new places and experience a lot of, have a bunch of new experiences. So growing up in the Bay Area, going to college in New York, and my grad program in Michigan, I also, all these blue stars, the smaller blue stars, were all places where I had different internships. I just would move to a new city and work there. So sometimes it was poorly paying, but I taught like some lessons to work it out while I was able to do internships I was interested in, or at least be in places I was interested in being in. So next, I want to talk a little bit more about my work at the lab. And again, I'm running through really quickly. So I put more information on than I can cover. So you guys can ask about it if there's something I haven't mentioned. But again, I've been here almost 2 years, and I am working in the electricity market and policy group. I guess I didn't mention this specifically, but I also did a dual degree at Michigan. So I did mechanical engineering, but it was more like grid electrical engineering and practice, and energy policy stuff, which I'd already done a little bit at National Grid. And so I work mostly in distributed solar. So I work with different compensation structures. So that is basically like if you put solar in your roof, how the utility pays you. It's a lot more complicated when you get into the nitty gritty. It has to do with value and equity. There's a lot of data analysis and collection. And so I do a lot of that. I also do some other work in utility business model stuff, and that kind of builds off of my work at the utility. And then I kind of over to the right put this pie chart of like how my year or how my days kind of break out. There's like obviously some meetings and emails, but a lot of the work, so 2/3 of the work is research, and some of it's quantitative and data stuff, and then half of it is a bunch of reading, writing, and sort of more technical and scientific communication. And then we use a lot of that for technical assistance to state regulatory governments. So states come to us and say they're interested in making a law, say, for how to compensate people for solar on their roof. And so we kind of direct some of our research to help educate those. So again, that was a ton of information, and I'm excited to chat more during Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing everything, Sydney. And for sure, we're looking forward to talking with you later on during our panel discussion. Our next presenter is Manuel Schnabel, who is a postdoctoral researcher for the Energy Storage Group. And so thank you, Manuel, for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, Manuel, and I want to start off just telling you a little bit about my background. Let's go to the next slide, please. And my background compared to Sydney's is it's a little more linear thematically, but it's quite international. So I actually only came to the US 5 years ago. And originally I grew up in a city called Basel in Switzerland. And what's interesting about this place is that the city is in Switzerland, but it's actually right where Germany, France, and Switzerland meet. It has suburbs in 3 different countries. So I grew up in a very international environment, and that's made me fairly fearless, let's say, about moving to different countries. And I've done that throughout my career. So actually, after I finished high school, I went to study material science at the University of Oxford in the UK. And material science basically is understanding what different materials are and why they behave the way they do. And there's a number of reasons that appeal to me. One was, when I was in high school, I really liked physics and chemistry because those were, to me, seemed fairly logical, rational fields where you can kind of figure things out. I didn't like biology very much because that seemed like a lot of just rote memorization. And material science is a way to combine physics and chemistry. So that's why it appealed to me. Actually, but the way I found out about it was a little bit bizarre. So the way I found out about it was our school got us all to take these career aptitude tests. And it showed up on the result of my career aptitude test. So that was the only way I even heard of it. It's not the reason I did it. The test also suggested I become an accountant, and I did not want to do that. But that's how I found out that this even existed and aligned with what I was interested in. And then also just fundamentally, like, there have been times where I was sitting in a classroom, I was wondering, why are all these things around me different? And of course you learn, you do go through the periodic table in high school, but I'd say virtually everything around you is made of 5 elements, maybe carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, iron, and aluminum. And yet there's more than 5 different materials around you, right? They all behave differently. And I was very curious about that. And so between all of that, that drove me to get really excited about this field and then study material science. Degrees in the UK are fairly short. So you can either go for 3 years and get a bachelor's, or for 4 years out of high school and they give you a master's. So that's what I did. And then after that, I decided I want to go to grad school. So I did a PhD actually at a national lab back well, it's in Germany, but it was only 50 miles from where I grew up. So I think of it as back home. And I did that at the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems. Fraunhofer Institutes are government labs in Germany, kind of like NREL or Berkeley lab in the US. And the way I gravitated towards this particular field was I was trying to find an overlap between what I had studied, the part of my undergrad that I was particularly excited about, which was kind of electronic materials and semiconductors. And that was partly driven by the fact that it's kind of a very, again, rational, analytical part of material science where things are understood fairly well. And also just because I had a really good professor in that field. And it was a small major, so I would say we were almost friends. And I just found that field very interesting. So I was trying to find an overlap between that and something I would be really passionate about. And I really cared about, and still do care about, clean energy and developing technology to make that happen. And so that's how I picked that out. The project that was available was to look at nanocrystal solar cells. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that on the next slide. So that's what I worked on during my PhD. And after that, in 2016 is when I came to the US. I joined the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is just outside of Denver in Colorado. And I was hired there to work on solar cells as well. So I did that for 2 years. And then an opportunity came up to start working on batteries, which sounded very exciting. So I took that. And then when my contract there was up, I moved to Berkeley lab in the Bay. And I continued to work on batteries, slightly different project. But basically, I worked on solar cells for the first 6-7 years of my career, and then on lithium-ion batteries for the last 3. So to tell you a little bit more about that, can we go to the next slide? So I want to share with you 2 projects I worked on. The first one is called Tandem solar cells. And I'll just explain a little bit about what this is and why it's interesting based on the top 2 figures. So what's shown in the top left graph here is the solar spectrum in gray. So the vertical axis is how much energy there is at each wavelength, and the bottom axis is wavelength, or color of light, if you like. And so the gray is the solar spectrum that comes from the sun. And the green is the amount that you can convert into electricity with a single solar cell. And if you change the material that you make that solar cell out of, you can change the wavelength where the green area starts, which on this graph is labeled as the band gap. So you can move that left and right. But depending on how you move it, you either decrease the transmission losses labeled in red, but then you increase the thermalization losses, or vice versa. So there's always a trade-off, and you can't beat 31% efficiency. And we're already pretty close to that in the lab. So lab cells get up to 27, 28. And the only proven way to get a lot higher is to stack different cells on top of each other. So if you have different solar cells that are particularly good at different wavelengths or colors of light, then you can have one, like the one shaded in blue in the top right figure, that is really good at the short wavelength light and cuts down on the thermalization losses. And then its transmission losses get captured by the other cells. And so this way you can ramp up the ultimate efficiency that you could get. And so it goes up to 42% for 3 cells, 49 for 3 cells, and so on and so on. And so there's a lot of research trying to do this, combine different cells with different architectures. And I worked on this in 2 different places, actually. The first one was at the National Lab in Germany, where we tried to do it with silicon nanocrystals on top of silicon. The cool thing about this is you're not changing the element. You're always using silicon, which is just super cheap. But if you make silicon crystals really, really small, they actually start responding to a different color of light well as compared to a large piece of silicon. And so you can make this kind of tandem structure by having a silicon nanocrystal cell on top and just bulk silicon on the bottom. And so we made that. That was actually the first one, and I think still is the first one ever made with both of these on top of each other. It didn't work very well. We got about 1% efficiency, and there's a whole bunch of engineering reasons for that. And it may be the reason no one else has tried it since. But then when I was at NREL in Colorado, we tried the same approach. We stuck with silicon for the bottom because that's just, the cheap commercial one that's easy to work with. And we used gallium phosphide for the top one. And that worked remarkably well. So there we got to 27%, which is still a far cry from the 40% numbers I mentioned, but it's better than what anyone can do with just silicon in practice. So that told us we were on the right path. And I think people who came there after me are still working on that. What's particularly cool about it is how the 2 cells are joined together, because ideally you would deposit one on the other directly, but in this case, that's just not practically possible. And so what we did here, there's this middle layer you can see with the big balls in it that's labeled TCA. That actually stands for transparent conductive adhesive. And so what we did literally was we took glue and we bought some like small squishy plastic balls that had a metal coating. We mixed it all together and we used that to stick the cells together. And so the glue kept them together and the metal coating on the balls created an electrical contact, and it worked incredibly well, almost as well as if we just welded the cells together. And so that was kind of cool and fun, and it worked really well. So that's just to share a little bit of the solar cell research. If you could click again, please. The second bit of what I work on, I want to share is using silicon for lithium-ion batteries. And the reason that's interesting is because silicon can store 10 times more energy than the negative electrode material that's used in current batteries. And so it could at least double the energy density of a battery, which means you can either make the battery half the size, or if the size of your battery is fixed, it can last twice as long, which might be cool for your cell phone. Or if it's an electric car, it could drive twice as far, which is very appealing. The catch with silicon is it tends to just react with oxygen in the air. And so it always has an SiO2 coating. And people have tended to find when they work with silicon, it doesn't always behave the same way every single time. And so what we were thinking here was, well, maybe it's because the reaction with air isn't the same every single time, and so your coating has a different thickness. And so we thought we would study that, and what we found was actually kind of remarkable, which is that there's a fairly sharp cutoff at about 3 nanometers of SiO2, where if the coating is thinner, then lithium goes in everywhere uniformly. And if it's thicker, then lithium only goes in at a few select specific spots. And you can see those in the photographs in the middle. So the ones labeled 1.4 and 3.2 nanometers, those are uniformly kind of golden where the lithium went in. Whereas the ones on the right, which are labeled 5.1, you can see there's just a couple tiny spots. And this is not like a fancy microscope. This is just a camera I think I took those pictures with my cell phone. So that's really just something you can see. And it's a direct effect of just a layer being, you know, maybe a millionth of the thickness of a human hair thinner. And then the other thing that's cool I've shown on the bottom here is if you look at one of those spots in a light microscope, you get that image labeled optical. And then you can use a fancy technique called SIMS to really map the lithium concentration to see if the spot is actually full of lithium like you think it is. And then what you see is that at a depth of 1 nanometer, so where it says C equals 1 nanometer, there's just a ton of lithium right at that spot. Once you go a little bit deeper at 5 nanometers, you're through the silicon dioxide, then it spreads everywhere. But then once you go a little deeper, it disappears. So it really does this cool thing where it goes in through these little holes and then it just spreads everywhere, which is firstly an effect that was just cool for us to see, but it's also useful in practice because it helps us control how lithium moves throughout this material. And putting lithium into it is how you would store energy. So that's what I wanted to share with you in terms of my background and the kind of stuff I work on. And I'm happy to now discuss with the panel.
Thanks so much, Manuel. So I will stop my screen share and I will introduce my co-host for today, Faith Dukes, and she'll introduce herself and then we'll get the panel discussion started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Elisa, for letting me come on. I'm excited to have this conversation with Manuel and Sydney. My name is Faith Dukes, and I am the Director of K-12 STEM education programs here at Berkeley Lab. I work with Elisa, and I'll also invite our panelists to come back on and turn their videos on too. And I also want to say for those of you in the audience, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. We will see them and we will bring them into the discussion as we get going. But Elisa, I think you have the first question, right?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Faith. Yeah, so I think first we'll go back to sort of thinking about your career trajectory. I thought it was interesting to hear about that both of you started talking about high school and how there were some teachers that were influential. And then Manuel, you mentioned in your PhD you had like a really good professor. So just a question of, you know, who or what were like the mentors and classes, teachers that were influential in you getting into this work? So maybe Manuel, do you want to start with talking about, you said you're very close to one of your professors.
Yes, in terms of people who influenced me to go this way, I'll start with one slightly comical story from high school. So when I went into high school, we had to pick subjects. And the way it worked in our school is I actually ended up having to pick between chemistry and music. And it was hard for me because I played piano a lot when I was in middle school as well. And we really couldn't decide, or I couldn't decide. And then we talked to the chemistry teacher and he basically told us that it was probably safer for everyone if I did the chemistry in school and the music at home rather than the other way around. So that's one way that happened. And then obviously I really enjoyed chemistry and physics, and that's how the material science happened. In terms of the professor, yeah, it was, there's a lot of professors that can be a little aloof or they just do their spiel, and it can be a little hard to really zero in on exactly what's important and so on. But this one professor, you know, he was in his 50s. He wasn't inclined to switch to PowerPoints, which was happening when I was in my undergrad. He had his overhead slides. He liked those. He presented with those, but he just taught remarkably well. Most of it from memory, and it just gave that the kind of semiconductor and electronics courses he taught a clarity that I didn't see in the other parts of my course. And I found that really appealing. So that's kind of why I went down that path. And he actually ended up being the external supervisor for my PhD work. And that's where I saw that even though he had way less resources in his university group than the giant national lab thing that I worked at, he actually sometimes had better ideas. And in the end, we managed to do some really good research by having him work with the national lab I was at, because they could scale up all the ideas he had. But it was just remarkable to see that it's not always just about resources. Like one guy with really good ideas can make a difference.
Thanks for sharing. And just to follow up, and then Sydney will turn over the question to you. A question just came from the audience, which I think is related to what we're talking about, is when was the moment you knew this is what you wanted to do and this was your place in life? Is there like a moment, or were there moments in your career trajectory that you could answer to for this question?
Yeah. Oh, so should I answer the first question or the second one?
You can both. I think they
Okay.
both work really well. Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of mentors, I guess I mentioned in high school I had some really good teachers, but I honestly, I think that the biggest mentors I had were probably, they came in college, because I think you're so focused on getting to college, and that's sort of the goalpost, that when you get there, you have like a bunch more options and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So again, that first semester I took this class, and it was with this, he was like a brand new professor. I think later on I realized it's his first class he ever taught. He was like this young guy, and he was really passionate about the work, and it really showed through. And he had like a ton of humility. So he also was like, he would be like, oh, it's a really good question, I don't know. And he would do all this research and follow up with us via email afterwards. So he was really engaged and very openly willing to learn from the students as well, like from our questions. So it was really engaging. And that I just ended up taking every single class that he offered, because I just really liked him as a professor. And what was funny actually was I was 2 years ago, I was in an airport. I was in New Jersey at Newark Airport, which is a terrible airport, so not in the best mood. And I saw him walk by. So it had been 11 years, or it had been like 10 years or something. And I was like, Mr. Opus, out of nowhere. And he turned around, and after 10 years, like, Sydney Forrester. And I think that just showed how engaged he was with the students. And he told me at that point, because we were more like, closer seeming in age, he was like, yeah, that's my first class. Like, I love that class. You guys are so engaging. Like, you asked me for my first ever, like, I wrote my first ever letter of recommendation for you. Like, I think about you guys. So he was really great. And then also there was this one other moment where, again, I didn't necessarily start in STEM, and I ended up, getting 2 degrees in engineering and doing a bunch of research in it. And even though I don't do it now, I stuck with it also in part because, so I went to Columbia, and it was really intimidating. And I had this one professor, so I was doing really poorly in this like physics class, just the base engineering physics class. And I was really concerned like about grades and stuff. And I went to talk to a professor, and he's like, he first laughed, which was not a great response, but he followed up with like, oh, I'm sorry. I know what's going on, like, sit down. And he's like, I haven't done this yet for this semester, but he showed a distribution of grades, and it looked like a camel with 2 humps. And he's like, I'm just going to take a stab and say, like, you do not take AP Physics, like, you have never seen this material. And he's like, you get a bunch of kids in college that have done this class before and are doing it for an easy grade. And that's this like lump at the top. And he was like, you're doing poorly in the class, but you're actually like, you're doing well in that second lump. Like, don't give up. These people shouldn't be in the class. So I think the lesson I learned there was just like, let someone know when you're struggling, because they can either help you or let you know if it's like, something can be consuming you, and it's not a big deal. Because for him, he was just saying like, I wish I could fail everyone who's just taking this class over again. Like, you're trying really hard, you're going to be fine. So this was like a non-issue. There were other times where I went into office hours and it was an issue, and I was able to get help and one-on-one help, and that was obviously super helpful. But anyway, so in terms of when when I decided I wanted to do energy specifically. So again, I was always really into sustainability, but I had this internship. It was one of my first internships in energy, and I was working actually in demand side management. So I was working with a bunch of building operators that basically, at that point, it was like calling people up and saying, we're gonna turn your air conditioner down 5 degrees for like on and off for a few hours because it's the hottest day in the year, and you get a bunch of money for like essentially curtailing your load. And so in that job, it was a bunch about like operation of the grid. And so I actually got to, there are these things called independent system operators, and they deal with all of the transmission lines that go across multiple states. And I got to go into the control room, and I just never really thought about like what happens when you flip on a light switch. Like there are engineers in these control rooms 24/7. So like even during COVID, they had them full staffed. I think they had 2 week shifts or something. Like they're in there making sure electrons are running, and that was just interesting enough. And then once you get into it and start realizing like, oh, there's a bunch of like policy questions, and this really hits upon everything with life. Like it hits upon like decarbonization, climate, different societal issues, water resource. You saw in Texas, like when the lights went out, also the water went out, so heat, etc. So it was so cool to me. And then it was definitely reinforced when, again, that law passed for the state of New York, when I realized like energy was not cool at all for 100 years, because it was just, you had big generators, you had lines, and you had consumers. And sometime, probably 10 years ago, when all these new technologies became cheap enough where they became prevalent enough on people's homes, etc., it got really interesting, because all of a sudden the consumer is becoming like the seller of the service, or they could be, and there's all these questions that have never been answered. There's all these technologies like batteries. Manuel can tell you that they don't look like those traditional generators or those traditional lines or even those traditional loads and consumers. So that law in New York was one of the first to really respond and try to be more flexible and dynamic with responding to that kind of paradigm shift. And that, like, getting involved in that and the nitty gritty questions there, just like looking through laws that have been around for 100 years. My great grandpa was one of the first engineers in our first hydroelectric alternating current power plant in Niagara Falls. So maybe it runs in the family, but I fell in love with it completely through various times. And being at the lab, I will say, I do mostly policy work, but I'm able to do distribution system modeling, data analysis. So also just the diversity of projects, being able to work with states and also be able to conduct your own research and being on a great team. I plan on staying here for years, if not decades. So I've definitely found it. And that was a fairly long answer, but I hope it was sufficient.
No, thank you, Sydney. Yeah, definitely your passion for this work really came through, and it's really cool that your grandfather was also involved too. Before we move to the second question, just want Manuel to have the chance to answer about the moment you knew this is what you want to do and this was your place in life. Then we can move on.
So it kind of went in steps. So I kind of narrowed it down over time. Like when I started my major, part of me was not totally sure I wanted to do science and R&D my whole life, but I figured, if you get a degree in something that has some element of math, then, that still qualifies you to do finance or whatever, a bunch of different things. And then towards the end of my degree, I realized, no, I want to do research. And I didn't know whether it was going to be, at a company or in academia long-term. But I got the sense, which by the way is not necessarily true, and we can get to that later, but at the time I got the sense that I would hit a glass ceiling if I didn't go to grad school. So that, in a sense, was my motivation for going to grad school rather than going straight to a company. And then I really enjoyed that, so I kept going with it. But it was a process. Like, I didn't wake up when I was 16 and know that where I am now is exactly where I wanted to be 16 years later. What I would say in terms of making that decision, don't rush into it. Take as much time as you need. Make sure you're doing something useful while you're making that decision. I remember I had a friend in high school. His younger brother, he had a really tough time with that. Like, he started college, he quit after his first year because he wasn't enjoying the major. Then he did something else, distance learning. And at some point, like, my friend who was his older brother just told him, I don't know what I want to do in life either, but I finished my college degree, I'm working, I'm doing something useful while I'm figuring it out. Like, it's okay to take time to figure it out, but do something meaningful in the meantime. And ideally, if you can, do things that'll help you figure it out. And the second piece of advice I would have, once you know what you want to do, go for it. Because if you keep spending time trying to gather this wide set of experiences, you're not going to go ahead as fast as someone who just focused. And at some point in your life, you may find it frustrating that, you know, someone who's 1 or 2 years younger than you is now 1 or 2 years ahead of you. So, I mean, again, I wouldn't say that, you know, you have to know what you're doing at 18 and then do just that. Take as much time as you need, but once you know, go for it.
Awesome, great advice, Manuel. And thinking about, you know, going forward and using all of your background and ideas in order to advance us in terms of energy, I want to talk a little bit about creativity, because I think, you know, we think of energy as Sydney said, you know, very straightforward generators. You plug something in, that's just it. But how have you brought creativity into the work that you do, especially around thinking about implementation and about materials, the development of new types of batteries or new types of systems that we can generate energy from? So I'll start back with Manuel again. How have you brought in creativity, or how do you see that impacting the research that you do?
Well, I mean, creativity comes in a surprising amount, considering it's, you know, kind of hard science research. You'd think it's all just logic, but if it was, we would have everything figured out by now. Typically, when you're in science, especially when you're in academia, you have to tackle tough problems that people haven't solved yet. And it takes creativity to come up with interesting approaches to do that. And that's particularly important when you're trying to apply for funding, because you have to show that, you know, you're not just doing the next obvious thing. You actually have a really good idea, which is going to fix something that people haven't been able to fix in the past. And that's especially true in the fields I've worked on, solar cells and lithium-ion batteries, which have thousands and thousands of people working in them. So most of the obvious stuff has been done. And it's sometimes a little frustrating to see paper after paper come out, and it's just people not being creative and doing the, you know, the incremental one step more of what they've already been doing, just because that's the safe thing to do, because it's not a risk. There's real value, even in the hard sciences, to people who are creative, who have totally new ideas, and who take a risk and try them. And like I said before, in the case of my professor, it's ultimately really noticeable in the impact of the research. Like he was moving that field forward more with his 5 people than some other labs that had 50 people. And it was just because he had good ideas. And one part of that, though, is even in kind of the busy nature of any job, you have to give yourself the time to do that and to be creative and to develop those ideas. I think oftentimes people feel like time that you spend thinking is not time you spend working, because you're not physically doing anything. But sometimes taking that time is really important, and it really makes a difference, at least in research, between impactful work and work that's just kind of turning the handle.
Yeah, I completely agree in terms of creativity and like idea generation and the whole thinking process as well, just because what I found really helpful is it can be really hard sometimes just fully engage in maybe someone else at a conference, them talking about something, and especially when it doesn't seem completely linked to maybe your interests or what you do. But there have been so many times where I've been sort of trying to brainstorm, coming up with ideas of new research, and something will trigger like this reminds me of something, or you know, just there's an inkling that you know, someone you heard from somewhere else, and developing relationships with people, even if it seems tangential at the time, is really helpful in terms of coming up with very interesting ideas to pursue, just because yeah, again, energy specifically is so interdisciplinary that you can just honestly, even just getting like an architect's point of view on building efficiency is a totally different way of thinking about it. Like I just remember I took a sustainable architecture class and I was just like, oh my, this is crazy different than the way we think about it. So just kind of taking new perspectives and really engaging with other people that might have different experiences than you has been really helpful. And also, I think just keeping like a work-life balance. Like you don't always have to be super creative at work. Sometimes you do have a little bit more of like the data analysis slog, like that just will happen. And I think it's really important, especially when we're all like virtual and online right now, to sort of set boundaries around your work, just so your 9 to 5 can be your 9 to 5. And then if you want to continue pursuing music, writing, art, whatever, you are giving yourself the space to do that too, because it's not always like you can be creative all the time.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, it can be hard to be creative when you're sat in an office and there's emails popping up the whole time. I'm probably not the only person who's had some of the best ideas in the shower or hiking, or back when we could do this at a bar talking to people.
Yeah, and Sydney, you actually touched upon sort of like a work-life balance as well, and it sort of relates to the question that we got in from our audience. We have a student who is curious about what was it like to dual major. As I know people say that they're exceedingly difficult, but was it easy to complete if you managed your time? Were you able to balance a social life and your academics?
Yeah, it was hard. I think, and this kind of goes, I think, towards the last question that will be asked, but like advice to yourself, and it is to sort of to be intentional with what you're doing. So why are you interested in pursuing a dual degree? Is it what is it going to achieve for you? And I think that if you've decided it's worth it, then it's absolutely worth it to give it a try. And in terms of the workload, I mean, I won't lie, it was a lot, and it was difficult. I think what I ended up doing was just like diving head in. I was also like, I was captain of the water polo team. I was involved in Engineers Without Borders, and I was like doing ultimate frisbee as well. So I was just like, I'm going to be busy. We're just going to be extremely busy. And I think that honestly, having organized sports for me personally, I think it could be something else for others, was helpful because it kind of was like a social network. And also like for me, it's a way for me to decompress is through activities like that. So I basically ended up kind of needing to structure everything, including my social time, which was difficult. But with that, it was really like I kind of prioritized like, do I like my roommates was important. Like, do you like the people you're going to be with all the time? Because that can also like be helpful socially and just honestly creating a space for it. But and again, I think one thing, this is maybe not everyone did this, but I started sacrificing, like I could get that top grade, but at the end of the day, I want this dual degree and I want to also maintain my personal happiness. So like the ability to get a B+ was like reasonable. To get that A- if possible, but I would be just like killing myself just trying to squeeze in that last hour of studying or whatever and sacrificing sleep. Like I just think my health and my happiness would suffer. So there were also like some decisions that probably impacted my GPA, but also I think if you're really passionate about what you're doing and the reason you're doing that dual degree is to get to a specific goal, you know, again, my passion for like the work showed through, and the GPA, the minor hits on the GPA I don't think it ended up mattering. So something that seems so important, you might have to sacrifice, honestly. You do sacrifice a little bit of time, a little bit of sleep, a little bit of grades for me, but it's all about finding, I think, your own balance. And I also, one other important thing was I didn't have to necessarily keep on going with the dual degree. What ended up happening was I had one degree after 3 years, and I actually almost quit on that second degree because it was getting hard. So I ended up sticking through it, which was great. It was actually mostly a funding issue, and I ended up getting funding, so I stuck with it. But that's also one other thing, like if you are completely miserable and then honest and you think like this is the thing I'm doing it for is not really relevant anymore, I think for me, it was helpful to know like there is an exit. So you don't have to necessarily follow it all the way through. You already have a degree. So I think that was helpful to keep in mind. But for me, it was really helpful. Honestly, I'm very glad I did the dual degree. The master's degree was a lot more chill, just because I did it in the maximum amount of time, and I was teaching, so I was being funded for my research and stuff, so I didn't feel that the workload is heavy, but it was a lot more intense, I think, for my bachelor's degree for undergraduate college. And also, I don't know if we give out emails, but if you have more questions, also feel free to email me about any more specific questions with the dual degree.
Thanks, Sydney. And speaking of degrees, we always ask this question, going on to get your PhD or your master's, is that something that you feel like people need to do in order to be in your field, or could they stop at just a bachelor's, or could there be some technical degrees that they receive? You can answer, Manuel and Sydney, both for your specific positions, but also if you want to bring up any other opportunities around or positions around you that you see have a little bit of different requirement, feel free to mention those as well. So Manuel, I'll start with you about, do you need the PhD to be the material scientist that you are? And then what are some other opportunities for employment or creativity, spaces where you don't need the PhD?
Right, so for my specific job, yes, you kind of do need a PhD. It's just in academia or even national lab research, that's kind of the natural progression. You do an undergrad, you go to grad school, you become a postdoc, and then you start applying for your own grants, having your own good ideas and hiring people, and it goes on. But that said, academic or national lab research is a fairly small part of the overall pie of STEM related jobs. And in many other jobs, I don't think you need to go to grad school necessarily. I don't think it hurts you, but I also think that's not the right way to think about it, because there can be this temptation when you finish undergrad, maybe you're not sure what to do. You kind of have an idea of what grad school would be like, because you kind of, maybe you've run into some grad students on campus, or you've seen the lab, so you kind of have a sense for what that would be like. And you should just do it because it's familiar and it can't hurt. But what it does do is it takes up 5 years of your life that you could be doing something else with. And so again, I think we're talking to high school students, right? So this is not a decision you would have. So the first thing is, this is not a decision you have to make right away anyway. The decision now would be, do you want to go to college, and if so, for what? This whole grad school decision is something that could be made in your senior year if you go to college. But again, even once you get there, I think it's worth thinking really hard, is dedicating 5 years of my life to grad school going to get me to where I want to be? Because like I said, those are 5 years of your life. And in some, especially if you work for a company, they might value 5 years of experience with them or in a similar company over a graduate degree, or not. I think there's some especially bigger, older companies with kind of more structured hierarchies who might care. But I think a lot of smaller or more dynamic companies, they're happy with a bachelor's and just showing you have the skills. And I mean, I think recently Elon Musk even came out and saying you don't have to go to college if you have the skills. I don't care if you only have a high school diploma. So it really varies, especially across different companies in the field. The one place where I would say you have to go to grad school is if you want to do academic or national lab research.
Yeah, I don't have a PhD and I don't plan to get one. I think that for me, it was helpful. Again, very different trajectory. And I finished my bachelor's and then I started work right away. So I guess sort of speaking in like an opposite side, I think that was really great, because a lot of employers also now have in their benefits, they'll pay for your continuing education. So if I had actually stayed with my past employer, I could have gone to school part-time and had them pay for it. So that is one reason to maybe not necessarily go straight from bachelor's to master's to PhD. I think also the way I presented my background seemed like really like I was doing this and everything is related, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do specifically within sustainability. Again, coming out of undergrad, and even when I was working at the utility, I was thinking like, I want to get into water. I still want to get into water resource. So I think that it was helpful to work in the industry and get a little bit of a different perspective and kind of narrow down, with energy being so big, what specifically do I want to do? And then one other thing, another reason I don't have to get a PhD is because I opted to doing research in undergrad and grad school. So you can do kind of more project-based education, and that's really great for industry, I think specifically. But if you do want to work at like a lab or something, you might need some publications. And so I very carefully selected a master's program where I could publish in the field I wanted to eventually publish in for this job I have now. So I didn't have to do the extra 5 years, which for me was absolutely worth it. I don't think I necessarily get paid as much, I think, as some other people with PhDs, but also I'm going to have 5 more years of income than they will. So I think like that's also, again, that's a big consideration. And I also think, of course, it does matter at the lab. I have a coworker who only has a bachelor's. But he is going back to grad school now because there was a little bit of a ceiling in the national labs in any sort of research space, and he kind of hit it in terms of salary and job position and stuff. So he actually is going back to grad school, but that's 10 years out of undergrad. So again, you don't necessarily have to go really quickly through. I think it's nice. I don't have debt right now, so it's nice to work. I really encourage working. And then the one last thing I'll say is I actually have a family friend who works at the lab as well. Actually, my boyfriend as well does construction, and he does solar installations, and you can, he doesn't have, he went back for his GED, but only has a high school education, and you can actually like work yourself up kind of more mechanically, like do mechanical stuff and be an engineer in practice. And then it makes it easier to go back to school again because your employer will pay for it. So you can even, you can even start working right away. I think I didn't go that direction again because I think that you miss out on a lot of earning opportunity. But so for me, bachelor's and then working was the best, and then going back again for a very intentional master's. But this, you can kind of do, like, there's so many different paths.
So I think it's worth saying though about jobs in STEM. Obviously we both work in research, and that's what we've been sharing. But research is a small part of the pie, and even in the renewable energy space, research is a small part of the pie. And most of the jobs in renewable energy right now in the United States, I think, are installing solar power. And that's basically construction / electrician type work, which I think traditionally hasn't required a college degree. And similarly, batteries, there's a lot more jobs in manufacturing and installation than there are in research. So all of these technologies, there's a lot of, I think typically they're called blue collar jobs associated with it, maybe more than the kind of research experiences we've been sharing with you. And then if we're talking about renewable energy, and I think Sydney touched on this earlier, it even goes beyond the STEM related jobs, because by now the regulation surrounding solar and wind and batteries can actually make more of a difference to how many or how quickly they're installed than the actual technology itself. And the prime example I like to bring up is that Florida has a lot less solar power than California, even though it's almost equally sunny. So you would produce the same amount of power, but just the amount of money you would make from it is a lot less in Florida because of how they regulate it. And that isn't going to be fixed by a scientist, that would be fixed by a politician or a lawyer. So if you happen to be excited about renewable energy, but you're not sure if STEM is for you, there's plenty of things that would advance renewable energy that are not classically STEM jobs.
Yeah, in my group, a lot of people don't necessarily have STEM backgrounds, and even though they do more STEMmy stuff in their day-to-day jobs, it's just developing the capabilities and skill sets.
Awesome. I think in the interest of time, we got to get to our last question, which I forget who pointed it out earlier, but what is the advice that you would give to yourself as a college student? And Manuel, somebody said, did you ever go back to resuming your musical studies? So you can also point that out to talk to your, past self. Whatever happened to going home and practicing? Did you actually do that while you were pursuing your STEM career, and the advice you would give to that student?
I did, but not enough to make it a second career. I always figured if everything else fails, I can, play at honky tonks throughout the country, but that's very much like a plan B by now. But I still enjoy it in my spare time, and I think that's a good way to do it. To have the thing that, you just enjoy for fun, and then something else that, has impact and gets you the paycheck. To answer the question you brought up about what advice I would have, I would say when you pick a career path, find something that you're passionate about, that you're okay doing the boring or mundane parts of that job. This idea that there's going to be a job where, it's going to be exciting and fascinating every single moment of every single day. I think that's a myth. Every job has mundane, repetitive parts. Even pro athletes spend a lot of their time following, training and meal schedules that someone else makes for them. So my advice would be, don't necessarily look for something that's going to be exciting every single day, because I'm not sure you'll find that. But find something where you're broadly excited enough about its mission and some of the day-to-day stuff that it makes you happy enough that you're okay with the less fun bits. And that ultimately is what at least I find fulfilling, on a kind of year time scale, when I look back and think, am I happy with what I'm doing? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, mine, I think I was the one that mentioned it before, but just again, being intentional. So I personally can get really overwhelmed when there's a lot of different options. And this was even just before kind of growing up with the internet everywhere. So I can't even imagine you guys have so much information at your fingertips. There's so many cool things it looks like you can do. So I think, again, just for me, it's really helpful to make decisions. So I think I explained this as walk with conviction towards something, but have the flexibility and sort of the humility again to know when it's not right, and to sort of take the off ramp, regroup, reset, and then choose a new goal and walk with conviction towards that. And again, just being intentional the whole way through. I think it's been, again, really helpful engaging in conversations with interesting people doing interesting things. They tend to come around and help you out further on. Helping people out never hurts, and you end up kind of collecting a pretty cool team and support system that it's surprising how long they stay with you. So again, just being really intentional, earnest, and having set goals with the ability to pivot.
Yeah, thank you both for the great advice. And we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you both again for being here. And I just want to remind the audience that this is recorded. It will be up on our website. I popped in the chat box. So again, thank you panelists for your time, and thank you audience for sticking with us for this hour. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.